Close to 200,000 Americans lost their lives fighting the Nazis in World War II, and yet hundreds of those Nazis and their collaborators eventually wound up living comfortably here in the United States, becoming U.S. citizens. How did it happen? That is the story we shall tell in The Nazi Connection, a story you have never heard till now, of how highly placed U.S. officials, despite the express orders of two presidents of the United States, invited Nazi collaborators, killers, to these shores to trade what they knew about the Soviet Union for sanctuary here.
Several hundred Nazi collaborators from Eastern Europe and Russia were smuggled into the United States for intelligence purposes.
Smuggled by whom?
State Department intelligence, specifically the Office of Policy Coordination. It was the first covert spy agency set up in the United States. It predated the CIA by several months.
Who is this man making these charges, and what gives him the right to say what he has just said? His name is John Loftus, and for 2 years he was a prosecutor with the Office of Special Investigations in the Department of Justice, responsible for weeding Nazis and Nazi collaborators out of the United States. His security clearance went 3 levels above top secret, but this young Irish Catholic attorney, now in private practice in Boston, has decided that his conscience demands that he bring to light what he says remained for too long, a dark and sinister top secret.
We had one unit of the government out trying to prosecute the Nazis, and other units of the government trying to secrete the information. We later established that the files pertaining to the Nazi immigration had been withheld from Congress, from the courts, from the CIA, and from the local agents of the Immigration Service.
Didn't President Roosevelt, didn't President Truman say specifically that war criminals were not to be brought into the country?
That's absolutely true.
And Jimmy Carter went even further in 1980, when he said that any Nazi war criminal who had gotten into the United States should be rooted out.
The world must never forget the lessons of the Holocaust. That is exactly the reason why, after 40 years of government inaction, I set up a special unit in the Department of Justice to root out Nazi war criminals who may be in hiding in the United States.
That was the unit John Loftus worked for, a unit that is still trying to denaturalize and or deport Nazi war criminals living in the United States. We asked Loftus who it was who had run the old OPC, the Office of Policy Coordination, that was responsible for bringing Nazi collaborators into the United States.
A man by the name of Frank Wisner. He was a former intelligence operator during World War II.
With the OSS?
That's correct. His boss was Alan Dulles in Germany.
The Office of Strategic Services, was it called?
Yes, it was.
Was there nobody in the State Department at a higher level who knew what was going on and okayed it? Did Frank Wisner have no boss?
There were 3 men who principally were Eisenhower's representative for Cold War affairs during the early 50s. C.D. Jackson, Undersecretary of H.E.W. Nelson Rockefeller, and Vice President Richard Nixon.
Would they have known that former Nazi war criminals were being employed by U.S. military intelligence and were being invited into the country, given U.S. citizenship, despite what they had done?
I read some classified information that indicated that a number of these programs were approved at the highest levels.
Whether Richard Nixon, the late Nelson Rockefeller, and the late C.D. Jackson, former publisher of Time Life, whether they knew is still an open question. But if they didn't know, then they too were being lied to, as was the case with the Congress later on. The story begins here, when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. Just a few months after the invasion began, the Nazis had captured huge tracts of territory that extended from the Ukraine to Byelorussia. Byelorussia was to be the Nazis' highway to Moscow. At first, the Nazis were welcomed as liberators by the people, scarred by the purges of Stalin. But that changed when the Einsatzgruppen, the Nazi mobile killing squads, entered. These units recruited collaborators from among the Soviet people to massacre hundreds of thousands of civilians. The Russian collaborators with the Nazis served so faithfully and so well that the Germans made the collaborators into their own SS division known as the Belarus SS.
We're talking about the leaders of an SS division that fought against Americans and the leaders of a Nazi puppet government in Belarus that by the end of the war had exterminated 25% of their civilian population, including nearly all of the country's Jewish population, some 750,000 Jews. I decided to pick one of the regions of Belarus and see if we could find how many Nazi officials from that region were in the country. All of them were. They knew that the entire Nazi government of Belarus, the president, the vice presidents, cabinet ministers, governors, mayors, police chiefs, were all living in America. They knew that.
Who's they?
The FBI, Army counterintelligence, Army foreign intelligence, the Department of State. They knew, and they recruited them because they were Nazis.
As early as 1946, the major espionage services of the United States and the Soviet Union were engaged in a clandestine conflict. The demand for intelligence was so great that a seller's market sprang up. Hundreds of former Nazis and Nazi collaborators found employment in one intelligence service or another. A few of the boldest worked for both sides. According to Loftus, emigres with intimate, if dated, knowledge of Eastern Europe and former Nazi intelligence officers competed to peddle fabricated reports to any intelligence service gullible enough to buy them. And OPC was a willing buyer. But I still want to make this clear. Did U.S. military intelligence know the kind of people they were bringing in?
Beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Shortly after being apprised of what Loftus had learned, Alan Ryan, head of the office Loftus worked in, sent a top-secret report in October 1980 to then Attorney General Benjamin Civiletti, saying that this was the single most important matter his office was engaged in. That report said, quote, "It should be apparent that the matters discussed in this report are extremely sensitive, both because of the number of Belarusian Nazis who entered this country and the extent to which U.S. government agencies apparently assisted that entry, possibly in violation of the law." John Loftus also gave a set of classified documents on the matter to Massachusetts Congressman Barney Frank of the House Subcommittee on Immigration. When you first heard this tale, Congressman Frank, what did you think?
I thought it couldn't possibly be true. I thought it was the kind of thing that paranoid type people make up and really wasn't true. To think that within a year or two after discovering the death camps, that the top officials of the American government could have been working with butchers, Nazi butchers, to kind of sneak them into the country. No, I didn't believe it.
Are you convinced now the story's true?
I'm convinced it's true, yes.
What has convinced you?
The documents I've read, either someone has done, for purposes I couldn't fathom, the most massive set of forgeries in history, or the documents make it very clear.
What documents have you seen, Congressman Frank, that convinced you?
One that I have right here, which is a page on Emanuel Jashuk, who was one of the Nazi leaders in Belarus, who was guilty of the worst kinds of crimes, smuggled over here, allowed to become a citizen.
What does it say?
It says, for instance, that in approximately February 1942, he was appointed mayor of Stolce. 2 months later, he was raised to the position of the head of the district of Stolce, which he held until 1944. People should understand that he was appointed to these positions in occupied Russia by the Nazis.
By the German Nazis.
By the German Nazis, and where he was, in fact, promoted because of his good work.
What was his good work?
His good work was to help, one, murder innocent Jewish people, two, to fight the Allies.
Why was U.S. intelligence so interested in bringing these people into this country? What did these Belarusians have to offer?
They convinced OPC and military intelligence to fund their operations, that they could provide the Americans with a secret army behind the Iron Curtain. It was a tragic lie. Every one of their operations had been penetrated by the Soviets.
During the 1950s, according to Loftus, the OPC dropped Belarusians inside the Soviet Union by parachute.
The parachute teams that were sent in had an astounding fatality rate. Nearly all the paratroopers were caught and killed within minutes after they landed.
Ostensibly there to set up a network, to set up a listening post, a watching post.
Oh, there was more to it than that. The program was assassination.
These were hit teams?
That's correct. They were to start a civil war behind the Iron Curtain.
Apparently they were not very successful. On the contrary, it was a botch.
It was worse than a botch. Many of the Belarusians were later identified as having been double agents. They didn't have much difficulty. The Soviets had penetrated both the British and the German intelligence services. As a matter of fact, the assistant to the German intelligence service, an ex-Nazi himself, was working for the Soviets since just after World War II. He had access to virtually every NATO document and passed them all to the Soviet Union.
That person was Heinz Felfer, who worked for West German intelligence after World War II. Felfer and Kim Philby of British intelligence helped convince the Americans of the value of the former Nazis, a group the Soviets had heavily infiltrated. It was not till several years later that it was learned Kim Philby was really a mole working for the Russians.
I read one top-secret State Department report that said that there were 22 different intelligence agencies interrogating the émigrés in the displaced persons camps, all competing with each other, all fighting over for the same Nazis.
That was part of the problem. No, it wasn't just one group bringing in these Nazis. They engaged in a competition, so they began to spy on each other. We seem to have had more intelligence agencies than there were countries to spy on.
Not only were Nazis brought to the United States, but U.S. military intelligence also sent a number of them to South American countries, according to Loftus. And we have learned that at least one South American country told the United States it refused to take any more Nazis.
And I would say that as a conservative estimate, there are more than 300 Belarusian Nazis living in America today.
Still alive.
Still alive.
Still operating American citizens.
That's correct. Some are still working for the government.
Some are working for quasi-governmental agencies like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. William Cratch is New York bureau chief and Gene Sosin head of programming for Radio Liberty. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty was once funded by the CIA, is that correct?
Yes, yes.
How come?
It would have been embarrassing to admit that this was an official government function. The worst kept secret, of course, of the Cold War because the Soviets knew about it, but it was always possible to say on the diplomatic level, this is a private organization and...
Crusade for Freedom, publicly supported.
Precisely.
The Crusade for Freedom was the way most Americans learned about Radio Free Europe. Although money for it was solicited from the American people, Radio Free Europe was funded almost entirely by the CIA. Radio Free Europe broadcast the news to the Soviets and was also used to transmit secret messages behind the Iron Curtain. It would seem that the people who worked for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, should be people, if you will, beyond reproach. Am I wrong?
Like Caesar's wife. Right.
Did you have a man named Stanislav Stankiewicz who worked here?
Yes, he was a freelancer for a number of years with our Belarusian service.
Who was Stanislav Stankiewicz? He was a Belarusian who received secret orders from the German SS to kill every Jew in his county.
In order to save ammunition, they had the Jews lie on top of each other in 2 rows, and they shot through the bodies. The blood seeped up through the sand at the end of the day, and the ground was still quivering. So they had to post guards on top of the graves until everyone had suffocated. The worst part wasn't found out until after the war, when Soviet doctors conducted autopsies. They could find no bullet wounds on any of the infants. Apparently, the Belarusian police decided that the babies were too small to climb out of the grave, and so they wouldn't waste a bullet on them. They were buried alive.
And this was done under the command of Stanislav Stankiewicz.
That's correct.
Now, we've heard tales, God help us, like this before. Question, what happened to Stanislav Stankiewicz?
He was recruited by American intelligence, given a good job with Radio Liberty, and became a citizen of the United States.
In 1948, in a displaced persons camp in Germany, Stankiewicz was apprehended by U.S. Army counterintelligence. After investigating his background, the U.S. Army concluded
that Stankiewicz is a security risk to the United States because he worked first for the Soviets, then for the Nazis, and then the Soviets again. And he will work for anyone who pays him. But rather than prosecute him, U.S. military intelligence recruited Stankiewicz as an informant and as a propagandist in America's Cold War effort against the Soviets. Stankiewicz was smuggled into America
And he moved into this quiet Queens, New York neighborhood where he lived in relative obscurity for over 20 years until John Loftus began his investigation.
We had prepared a case against Stankovic containing his confessions, his admissions of Nazi background, and were ready to prosecute.
As a last step, the Justice Department asked their Soviet counterparts to provide some eyewitnesses for the case.
We received a cable from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the Soviet Union that Stanislav Stankovic had just died.
Well, he died in the United States?
And the Soviet government knew about it almost immediately.
This is a man brought into the United States to work for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty.
The security clearance would have been done by the agency in those days. So
By CIA.
by CIA, indeed.
You had another man who worked here, Vilis Hasners.
Yes,
The Immigration and Naturalization Service tried to deport Mr. Hasners, correct?
that's correct.
Failed, correct?
Yes,
Did you read the record against Hasners, the witnesses who testified?
yes. Yes, we did.
And you know that among other things, here is one thing said about Hasners. One of the witnesses testified that on another occasion in July of 1941, he saw the respondent, Hasners, and other Latvians force a number of Jews into a synagogue, which they then set on fire. Does he still work for Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe?
I believe he still contributes, or he now again contributes, freelance programs, yes.
The Justice Department told us they had botched the case against Hasners. Mr. Hasners would not talk to us, on or off camera. But Anton Adamovich, currently a staff writer for Radio Liberty, agreed to. We read, Mr. Adamovich, some of the information the Justice Department had gathered on him. You were a propagandist for the Nazis. Then you became an informer for the U.S. Army
Yes,
intelligence.
yes.
And
because-
then it was as a result of that that you were brought into the United States.
Yes, that's
Okay.
generally that's right. Yes,
That's correct.
In
And you know that both President Roosevelt and President Truman said that Nazi collaborators
Yes, I knew.
were not supposed to come into the United
I
States.
I knew.
So
And-
that you knew that you
yes,
came into the United States illegally.
Yes, yes.
You
yeah,
knew
no,
that.
No, I came legally and I told everything about my background when I was admitted to USA.
To the FBI.
Yeah, of course.
And the FBI said,
And FBI said, all right, we knew this. And
we knew you were a Nazi collaborator.
Yes, and it's...
We knew that you helped
yes,
Army
yeah,
intelligence.
yeah.
We'll reward
Yeah,
you
yeah.
in spite of the fact that you were a Nazi collaborator.
Yeah, that's right, that's right. We had no choice. Yes, we had all, we could be only collaborates with Soviet, with Bolsheviks, which we hate. 7 years I was persecuted by Bolsheviks.
Right?
Yes, or with these Nazis.
Dr. Vito Tumash, who lives in this house in the Bronx, also made that choice and had his past history kept secret by U.S. intelligence services. Tumash was for 3 months the Nazi-appointed mayor of Minsk, the capital of Byelorussia during World War II. On several occasions, we tried to talk with Dr. Tumash about his reported role in recruiting the local police force, which massacred 45,000 persons. But he refused to appear on camera. You let us into your home, and then you say you were unwilling to talk about these allegations.
I'm sorry, I did not talk. I cannot talk.
Off camera, he admitted he was indeed the Nazi mayor of Minsk, but he denied having anything to do with the extermination of Jews. By the late 1970s, with stories continuing to surface about Nazi war criminals in the United States, a House Congressional Committee chaired by then-Congressman Joshua Eilberg requested files on 111 alleged Nazi war criminals living in America. Among those on the list were 2 Belarusians, Franz Kushel and Emanuel Jasiuk.
In 1978, Congress specifically asked the General Accounting Office to get information on these 2 people. The General Accounting Office asked the Army about it, and they were lied to. The Army simply lied to the General Accounting Office in 1978 and said, we don't have files on these people. They had the files.
The Army sent a letter through channels to Congressman Eilberg stating that they had searched certain very specific vaults for all files pertaining to Kushel and had found no others. That information was a lie. I went down to the identical vaults and retrieved the Army intelligence files for Kuchel. 1 year later, after Eilberg had been told that no such files existed.
What would be the motive of the Army to lie?
If Congress had been given either the Kuchel or the Jazyuk dossiers, it would have inevitably unraveled the entire smuggling operation. The information had to be suppressed at all costs.
In 1978, the Congress was finally trying to get to the bottom of the Nazi connection. On behalf of Congress, John Tipton, a GAO investigator, requested all intelligence files on alleged Nazis living in America. After a careful review, he wrote this report for the GAO entitled Widespread Conspiracy to Obstruct Probes of Alleged Nazi War Criminals Not Supported by Available Evidence. But now Tipton says that apparently he didn't get all the available evidence. We then showed Mr. Tipton a note that had been inserted into the file he requested. Defense material not cleared for review by GAO. Do not disclose to GAO until notified to do so. So the Department of Defense was covering up material that the Congress asked for concerning Nazi war criminals and their admission into the United States.
Unless there's another reason for it.
We then read to Mr. Tipton from the FBI file on Emanuel Jasyuk, another file he had been told did not exist. Subject, name of the man that we're talking about, who was allegedly a war criminal and caused deaths of people in Poland, now resides, gives his address, Passaic, New Jersey. Were you informed about all that when you asked about that in 1978?
I was not aware of that aspect of it.
That information was in the hands not just of the Defense Department, but of the FBI at the time you asked for it.
It appears to be that way. That, I think, is the first time I've seen that document.
And there can be little doubt from this document and from Defense Department documents that they lied to you and said they had nothing on this individual.
That seems to be the case.
So the Congress was misled back in 1978.
That's correct. From the information that John Loftus has showed to me and you showed me here today, I would have to say that that appeared so.
Here in the top secret vaults in Maryland, John Loftus discovered how the Army had been able to keep the Nazi smuggling operation secret for so long a time.
They routinely were deleting all documents showing that the government had assisted their entry. And I caught them at it. We went down and confronted the Army officials, and they said that they thought that we knew all about the sanitizing program. Apparently it's a routine procedure with them. And the procedure was established many years ago, and they were just following routine orders. And for one day, I was allowed to look through the dossiers with no deletions, and of the 10 dossiers I looked at, 3 had letters evidencing government assistance in entering the United States.
And these 3 were Belarusian war criminals.
2 were Belarusian, and the 3rd was Hans Felfer, the Soviet spy working in the German intelligence service. He had been assisted in coming to the United States.
These people had a mission, which was to defeat the Soviet empire in Eastern Europe. A very admirable mission, one that was clearly in our national interest. The trouble was that they went out and did it on their own with no weighing of consequences, with no sense of what harm they might be doing to other interests, to our moral fiber. I don't impugn Wisner's motives, but his operation, almost from start to finish, as documented here, was a disaster for the United States.
But it is a disaster that might still be continuing. Loftus had yet another example of a mass murderer coming to the United States. Because the information is still classified, he cannot reveal the subject's name. Are criminals, are undesirables, in the context of which we're speaking, still being brought in today?
The person whose file I read, there was substantial evidence that he had persecuted hundreds of thousands of civilians.
And he was brought in how recently?
Recently.
And he was brought in because?
He had been working for OPC.
Way back then?
That's correct.
Someplace along the line, I get the feeling that you got rather frustrated by your experience in Washington at the Office of Special Investigations and inside the Department of Justice.
Very much so. federal judges are extremely reluctant to strip someone of his citizenship unless there's an actual proof of murder, of blood on their hands. Did you ever try and prove a murder trial 30 years after the fact with all the witnesses behind the Iron Curtain and none of that evidence available to you? The most infuriating part was that these people had confessed over and over again to the intelligence agencies. We had all the information on their war crimes and their atrocities, and we couldn't use one piece of that material in court. It didn't comply with the rules of evidence.
Was there the desire to do the job? I mean, the fact of the matter is that this has gone on for 35 years, and nobody until this moment has had the desire to tell the story.
The Office of Special Investigations bent over backwards to spare as much staff and money and resources as they could.
I get the impression that nobody really wants to handle this. Why have you gone public?
Wouldn't you? We have to let it be known that we will never allow people who kill babies to go free, no matter how long it takes us, or how well they hide, no matter how well connected they are. Someday, the truth is going to come out. There is no statute of limitations for mass murder. And sooner or later, someone like me or someone else will come along and find out the truth.
A couple of footnotes. Richard Nixon's office said that he would have no comment on his knowledge of what we have reported, and the FBI told us that due to the classified nature of the information we've detailed, they too would not comment.
Good evening. It is now 32 years since the fall of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich. But although that is now ancient history to a whole generation, the hunting down of Nazi war criminals continues, even here in the United States. In January alone, 4 new cases entered the courtroom phase in this country. They are not on trial for alleged war crimes. Under U.S. law, they cannot be tried for that. They can only be charged with breaking the immigration laws and, if convicted, may be stripped of citizenship and deported or extradited. But that's where the complications set in. Jim?
Robin, since the end of World War II, the Justice Department's Immigration and Naturalization Service has received 213 allegations of Nazis living in the United States. Half of them were adjudged groundless or were against people dead or missing. Of the remaining 106 that were officially investigated, the final box score as of now goes like this: 1 deportation, another ordered deported but held up through legal complications, 9 cases for deportation or denaturalization now in the courts, and 3 more ready for court action. The questions that this record raises, and the ones we consider tonight, are whether the U.S. government has done its best to ferret out and prosecute Nazi war criminals, and if not, why not? A recently published book has brought this entire issue to public scrutiny. It's called Wanted: The Search for Nazis in America. The author is Howard Bloom. Mr. Bloom centers much of his attention on 3 specific cases. That of Andrija Artukovic, accused of supervising the murder of 30,000 Jews in Yugoslavia. He was the one ordered deported after 8 years of trials, but then not deported on grounds that he would be politically persecuted by the Yugoslavs. Artukovic is retired from the construction business and currently lives in Surfside, California. Second, the case of Valerian Trifa, accused of being a member of the pro-Nazi Iron Guard in Romania and supervising the hanging and throat-slitting murder of hundreds of Jews. He entered the United States after the war and became a naturalized citizen. Denaturalization proceedings against him have been in the courts since 1975. Trifa lives in Detroit, where he is Archbishop of the Romanian Orthodox Episcopate of America. And third, the case of Cherim Supsakov, on whom we plan to focus in detail tonight. Mr. Supsakov lives in Passaic, New Jersey, where he is the Chief Purchasing Inspector for Passaic County. Mr. Bloom, first, a general question. Based on your investigation, how many Nazi war criminals are now living in the United States?
Well, I'm prepared to accept the Immigration Service figure that 143, that's the latest figure they've told me, alleged former war criminals are living in this country. But again, as you said before, the most significant figure is number 1. Only 1 has ever been deported.
Well, what is your overall conclusion as to why the U.S. government has not done more to find these people and prosecute them or deport them, as the case may be?
Because I think the U.S. government is not committed to doing anything in these cases. I think there's a well-concerted policy a policy involving the CIA, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, people in Congress, and the FBI, which has allowed these men to live in this country, which has allowed America to become as safe and protective a haven for war criminals as Argentina.
Are you saying there's a conspiracy to do this, or has it just happened?
I would say there's a concerted policy, a policy which is pervasive in many agencies in the United States government.
All right, let's talk about specifics now. In the case of Cherim Supsakov, the New Jersey man, what is he accused of doing?
Well, according to our Immigration and Naturalization Service, he is a member of the cases of the U.S. Immigration Service is investigating. This fact was published in the New York Times, and it was on CBS TV. The New York Daily News quoted a document from the Berlin Document Center stating that Mr. Supsakov was on the roster of the Waffen-SS. According to this Berlin Document Center, he also performed duties with SS Einsatzgruppen. The members of the SS were volunteers. No one from the occupied countries was drafted into the SS. According to witnesses living in Passaic County today, other Circassians, Mr. Supsakov was involved in the gathering of civilians by the SS.
I see. And what is he accused specifically of doing? Gathering civilians and then being involved in what acts after the gathering of the civilians? Where does the accusation end?
Well, the accusation ends, according to the people in Passaic County, just at the gathering. We're not trying to try Mr. Supsakov of anything. We're hoping that he will answer these charges, that will come before a court in this law, whether or not he was evasive at best in telling us about his past when he entered this country. When he came to this country on his immigration visa, he stated that from 1943 to 1945, he moved with the retreating German army until he reached Villach, Austria. If the Berlin Document Center is correct, if these facts are correct, he was at best evasive. He has told the Passaic County papers, the Patterson Newz, that he was a semi-forced laborer, a transportation worker.
All right, now back to the situation in the United States. What does the record reflect in terms of the U.S. government's actions against Mr. Supsakov?
Well, the case is still active now. According to witnesses...
Active in what way? I mean, is it an investigation, or is it before the courts, or where?
It's active with the Immigration and Naturalization Service. They have said that the case is active. According to people in the Passaic County area, people who want to testify, they at one point approached the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and their testimony was not taken. It was abruptly terminated.
What do you attribute that to?
I don't know. It's something I would hope Congress would look into.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel that the government has moved properly and swiftly against Mr. Supsakov?
No, I don't. If Mr. Supsakov, his past is as he maintains, if he was a semi-forced laborer, a transportation worker, well, I'd like to see those charges resolved one way or the other. It should not remain allegations one way or the other about Mr. Supsakov's past. Those should be resolved.
All right, Mr. Bloom, thank you. Robin?
Thank you.
The case of Cherim Supsakov remains active, according to the Immigration Service, but won't be prosecuted unless further evidence turns up. Mr. Supsakov and his attorney, Michael Dennis, are with us tonight. Mr. Supsakov, how do you respond to the charges against you that are raised in Mr. Bloom's book?
Absolutely false. All his statements and contents of that book, absolutely all of them are false. I can state openly and irrevocably, there is nothing truth in that. Twisted truths, pretending not the war crimes, but others, twisted. But generally, 95% of that book is absolutely false.
According to the Berlin Document Center, which Mr. Blum has repeated, you were an Obersturmführer, or second lieutenant in the Waffen-SS. Is that not true?
Let me put this way. I wear that uniform, but I never was any official. I never was in any service by the so-called Waffen-SS. And if we had time, I could explain, but to make shorter, unless you provide us time, I never executed any orders. I never belonged to any Einsatzgruppe, as he said just now. I never participated in any form or shape with the SS.
But you did wear the uniform, you said.
Yes, I did.
Why was
in order
that?
to save myself and to save about 35 to 40 people of refugees who were hiding from the Germans and the advancing Soviet troops.
Were you employed by the CIA after the war?
No, sir.
You
No,
were
sir.
not?
No, sir.
Were you employed by the OSS?
What is that?
That was the Office of Strategic Services that preceded the CIA.
No. I never heard of them existing even.
Did you work for the United States government after the war?
No.
You did not?
No.
You, in other words, you deny everything that is mentioned that would implicate you in any way with having served in the German armed forces, having served on the Russian front with the German forces, having rounded up peoples in Romania.
First, let me say one thing. In that book, I had to laugh when I saw that special one sentence. I supposed to be was rounding up the communists and the Jews. For this, information of that young man who wrote that book, in our territory there was non-Jews whatsoever. We had Jewish colony about 300 kilometers who living with our people, where I never went there at that time or after or before. They were saved like as in heaven. Our Circassian people, neither I, neither anyone of my ethnic group ever had anything to do with the Jewish people for reason they never were our enemies.
Well, let's discuss that with Mr. Blum. Mr. Blum, what is your reaction to Mr. Subsakov's denial of all this?
Well, I think tonight is the first time that I've ever heard Mr. Subsakov say that he was in an SS uniform, that he even wore it. What I've read in the papers and what he told me when I interviewed him, he confirmed the report that he was a semi-forced laborer, a transportation worker.
May I
Mr. Dennis, yes.
have a word? I don't believe Mr. Blum ever tried speaking to Mr. Subsakov on the point, and I think it would be very interesting to find out whether Mr. Blum ever checked with Simon Wiesenthal in Vienna at the Documentation Center for Nazi war criminals. We did, and Mr. Subsakov was given a clean bill of health. It's also very interesting that Mr. Blum never checked with the B'nai B'rith Anti-Defamation League war criminal section, which we did. He was given a clean bill of health. It's also interesting to find out that Mr. Blum is not aware that the mayor of Adepsakai number 1 gave a statement to the Immigration Naturalization Service stating first that Mr. Subsakov was never near the place where the 3 individuals were executed. Second, that the mayor said they were not executed by the Germans, but were executed by their own people for excesses committed by them under Soviet rule.
Mr. Blum. Can we have Mr. Blum's reaction?
I would just like to say that Simon Wiesenthal was contacted this weekend, and this very weekend he seemed to deny that. He said Mr. Subsakov should be investigated. He seemed to deny, and I don't think now is a proper time to engage in a trial, whether the people who talked to me in Patterson were correct or whether the mayor was correct. What I would like to do is see the investigation proceed by the people who are qualified in the government agencies and have it resolved there.
Well, there's one thing, Robin, I think we should point out that our reporter, Jim Wesley, did contact Mr. Wiesenthal, and he said, Mr. Dennis, that his organization had never cleared Mr. Subsakov, that they don't clear people one way or another, and they had never done that. But
I have a
letter
to
throw it
here
into the hopper. Yeah.
From Mr. Wiesenthal, dated December 4th, 1974, in response to an inquiry by a Mr. Rusak in New Jersey, who is a friend of Mr. Subsakov. He sent a letter on July 30, 74 to Mr. Wiesenthal. Mr. Wiesenthal on December 4 said he acknowledges receipt of the letter. He says the matter of Subsakov is just being examined by the Immigration Naturalization New York. He said the question is whether declarations he made when asking the permission to immigrate in the U.S. have been true. Then he says, that's all I can say about him. We, too, want no more than the truth.
Well, tell me, Mr. Dennis and Mr. Subsakov yourself, how are you going to get your name cleared?
It's very simple. Tonight, we have started a lawsuit against Mr. Blum, Mr. DeVito, the publishers and the distributors for $10 million. We are providing the courtroom to Mr. Blum to prove the truth of his charges. We have done that earlier with the network that Mr. Blum mentioned, the CBS TV network. We started a lawsuit a year ago in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York, and that is pending and will be ready for trial in a very short time. So we will give Mr. Blum a full opportunity to prove the truth of his charges.
Do you have any further response now, Mr. Blum?
I look forward to it. I hope that justice will be done.
Right. Well, that is just one of these very complicated cases. Certainly the most dramatic question, to Americans perhaps, is whether or not the Immigration Service actively obstructed investigation and prosecution of such cases. Was there a cover-up and conspiracy in the U.S. government? One man who says yes is the man Mr. Dennis just mentioned, Tony DeVito. Mr. DeVito is a former criminal investigator for the Immigration Service. He resigned in 1973 and has completed a manuscript of his own about the hunt for Nazis in America, and he also figures very prominently in Mr. Howard Blum's book. Mr. DeVito, you appear from Mr. Blum's book to believe there is an active cover-up by agencies of the U.S. government which prevents prosecution of these cases. Is that so?
That is my opinion. I stand by that opinion, yes.
What evidence do you have of that?
Well, I didn't realize that a cover-up was taking place until 1972 when Vince was working the Ryan case and I got assigned to assist him in the matter.
That is the case of Hermine Braunsteiner Ryan,
right,
who is the only deportee of these cases.
That's the only one,
right.
Yes. During the course of that case, while reading the file, I merely want to bring these factors in line. During the course of that case, especially at the beginning, I read a strange memo right from the outset, stemming from Washington. To break it down from bureaucratic jargon to simple terms, it meant, roughly, Mrs. Ryan has suffered enough. She's married to a citizen. You haven't got the evidence. Why try? Words to that effect. That's a strange communication because throughout my career, I never saw anything like it. However, that's not conclusive. During the course of the Ryan case, we were interviewing witnesses, and I was making a record of these interviews. Vince would review them periodically to see which ones he desired for recall at a later date for the deportation hearing. I had accumulated about 12 of these, 13, when an overnight break-in had occurred. I stored them in a Ryan file cabinet, and I noticed the following morning about 7 or 8 of these statements had disappeared from the Ryan file.
What, Mr. DeVito, what motive would anybody have in the Immigration Department or wherever else for removing files or for trying to slow down the investigation?
What motive would there be? Well, I can only tell you this. Based on my experience at the New York office, these people took orders from Washington. Now, the motive, if there is to be found one, you must start from Washington on. But in any event, I merely bring out the strange disappearance of the Ryan file cabinet documents. In addition to that, we had another strange event. I felt as if some secret documents, classified material, had leaked out to unauthorized sources. And when I called for an investigation, I was told, and Vince was present, there would be no investigation.
Sorry to hurry you along, but you also strongly imply in the book, or you're quoted as implying, that this is the work of the secret neo-Nazi organization Odessa. Is that what you are claiming? Is that what you mean?
Yes, let's put things in proper perspective. When I mention Odessa, you're mentioning a small organization within a large organization. What I really meant is a Nazi international, in effect, which has been accepted by appropriate authorities in the field. Now, when I say Odessa, it is a term, it's a small term, specifically for people who do not understand what I'm talking about. But insofar as a cover-up is concerned, I believe that there has been a cover-up in the Immigration Service, and where it stems from remains to be seen. The only way we're going to find out if a thorough investigation takes place.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
Mr. DeVito's superior in the Immigration Service, whom he's referred to a couple of times in the last few minutes, during the deportation trial of Hermine Braunsteiner Ryan, the only former Nazi to be deported, was Vincent Schiano. Mr. Schiano was the immigration's chief trial attorney in New York, but he resigned too and now has a private law practice. Mr. Schiano, do you believe there is a conspiracy in the U.S. government to cover up these cases?
We must divide. I do not believe there's a present conspiracy. I wish to make certain corrections. Number one, Hermine Braunsteiner Ryan was not deported. There is no Nazi deportee. She was extradited. During the course of the deportation proceedings, that extradition request came from the German government. Number two, I do object to the use of my name in that book in such a fashion as to be deemed supportive of the observations of either Mr. Blum or Mr. DeVito concerning certain things. Now, that does not mean I did not strongly advocate a pursuit of Nazis in the United States. However, observing proper and precise legal procedures with due regard to the rights of individuals. I do believe that we were obstructed in the Ryan case. There were no files missing. There were certain notes missing. There were certain mysterious events. I did not receive perhaps the support I should have received. However,
how do you explain that?
Oh, there may be many explanations, not necessarily amounting to a conspiracy. Might be inefficiency, might have been personal against me for other reasons. I think Mr. DeVito retired rather than resigned in 1973. I resigned. Now, concerning other aspects of the Ryan case, perhaps we did not receive the full cooperation as compared to other cases I prosecuted. Now, the other Nazi cases, I had advocated that they be an organized task force, which eventually did come about after we perhaps went to Congresswoman Holtzman to help support this proposition. And however, at the present time in the Immigration Service, I am more than satisfied with the integrity of the people conducting the investigations of these persons, with the results that they obtain, and they should be commended concerning results in the past 3 years. I know that people in charge of some of these investigations have a high regard for them. What happened previous to 1973, perhaps dating with the Ryan case backwards, I think I would probably be disappointed and may merit or warrant a certain inquiry by a proper impartial committee.
Can I ask you this? Overall, how would you rate the accuracy of Mr. Blum's book?
I do not subscribe to the observations or allegations. I do not subscribe to the idea of an Odessa infiltration of the government. We sought our search, both Mr. DeVito and myself, I thought was to be a proper search for alleged Nazis in this country, not a search for sensationalism. I think that would be an obscenity upon the victims of the Holocaust. I think we're looking for American justice, not sensationalism.
How do you respond to Mr. Sciano, Mr. DeVito?
This is the first time I've heard Mr. Sciano speak along these lines. I'm really surprised and shocked. Now, I can say some things to indicate some foul play within government. I don't know just how far I can go, but you must understand one thing. During the Ryan case, Ryan witnesses were threatened. My wife's, they started to work on my wife. And I can tell you another incident where they worked on another witness in another matter, discouraging him from going to Germany. And I can tell you other factors, which it better remain within law enforcement. Perhaps we can get at the bottom of this thing. But the fact that I'm hearing a different tune tonight, you've heard it. This is the first time I've heard it. However, since 1973, since Mrs. Ryan left, right? Since then, how many Nazis have been removed from the United States, or alleged Nazis? None. And it doesn't take no 4 years to move these people. It takes a hell of a lot less time.
I disagree with that. First, Tony DeVito was of great help to me during the Ryan case. I think he may be carried away by certain things. The Ryan case was started in 1964, the denaturalization, and that is a complicated procedure. The American justice system works on the basis of evidence, not allegation, strong evidence, to strip someone of their United States citizenship. Thereafter, consideration must be given to a deportation process if that process is available based upon the evidence and the law existing at that time. In the Ryan case, there was a memorandum which might have suggested that perhaps our case against Mrs. Ryan should not be pursued that vigorously. It was a legal question.
Can I just ask you both very briefly, yes. Do you think there should be an investigation of these matters? Official investigation?
Investigation
of the
cover-up?
Alleged cover-up.
Oh, yes, I think that investigation should be conducted and should be focused on probably prior to 1972.
Mr. DeVito, you evidently think there should be an investigation.
I think there should be an investigation. You're talking about a list of Nazis that came into my possession, which only was surfaced, right? Not through me, through a dead man, Robert Morse, who called for an investigation back in '73.
Okay, I think we'll leave that there. You both think there should be a further investigation. Jim?
Yes, Robin. First thing I would like to say to Mr. Dennis in New York is that I've been corrected. Our reporter, Jim Wesley, did not talk personally to Mr. Weisfeld, but that came through a third party.
Thank you.
All right. The question of official indifference and corruption has concerned the House Subcommittee on Immigration and Citizenship for the past 2.5 years, the subject that Mr. DeVito and Mr. Schiano have just been talking about. On January 13, its chairman, Congressman Joshua Eilberg, a Pennsylvania Democrat, asked the General Accounting Office to look into the matter. In his letter to the GAO, Eilberg wrote that he was particularly interested in finding out if immigration had, quote, deliberately obstructed active prosecution of these cases or engaged in a conspiracy to withhold or quash information, end quote. First of all, Congressman Eilberg, how do you read the record of the U.S. government in prosecuting war criminals in a general way?
In a general way, I feel that we've had a continued neglect for some 30-odd years. I became chairman of the Immigration Subcommittee a few years ago, and in connection with our oversight authority, that is to see that the Immigration Service and the State Department do their job insofar as the immigration laws are concerned, it became our duty then to look into this subject. And I found great indifference and feel that if our subcommittee had not acted when it did, that the recent cases that have been brought to prosecution would never have been brought to prosecution.
You think they came about solely as a result of pressure that your committee's work
I would say that our subcommittee was the major force in bringing these cases to this point. And I would say that this was the result of constant prodding over the past 3 years of the agencies involved. The Immigration Service, the Justice Department, the State Department, and I mean just hard plugging.
Well, Congressman, you used the word indifference. You did not use the word conspiracy. Do you feel, based on what you know now, that this is a result of just indifference? And if so, what's caused the indifference?
It's hard for me to answer that question precisely. I do not know yet whether there was a conspiracy. We have, as you said at the outset, started a congressional investigation by the investigating arm of the Congress. I feel it extraordinary that over a 30-year period, no prosecutions were brought. I intend to find out why. I know that over the past 2.5 to 3 years that it's been like pulling teeth to get these various agencies to work, and I'd like to know why it has taken so long to move the cases that are presently being prosecuted.
What do they tell you, Congressman, when you ask them, when you ask somebody in the Justice Department or the Immigration and Naturalization Service why it's taken so long?
Well, we are told that they will then do something else. Now, at the time that our attention was focused on this, there was one man investigating in New York this entire Nazi war criminal proposition for the entire Immigration Service in the United States. As the result of our initial efforts going back a couple of years now, the Immigration Service assigned one man to each active case. They came back to us only after continued prodding to say that there were no eyewitnesses present in the continental United States against alleged Nazi war criminals living in the United States. It then became incumbent upon me and my staff and my subcommittee to visit behind the Iron Curtain, to visit Israel, to find people who, in authority, whether in the Russian government or the Israeli government, who told us that there were witnesses and that those governments were willing to cooperate. We then came back and put the pressure on the State Department, on the Immigration Service, on the Attorney General, and it was only then, after these eyewitness accounts that we brought back of conversations with governmental counterparts, that our government began to move, and we intend to remain with this until these cases are marked closed.
And you're going to go all the way. You're going to get the GOA report, and if that requires further action from your committee, you're going to pursue it. Is that right?
That's right, and we'll follow the GAO investigation very closely, you may be sure of that.
All right, Congressman, thank you. Robin?
Thank you all in Washington, and gentlemen, thank you all here. Obviously, that raises a great many question marks, and perhaps we'll have some answers in the future. Jim Lehrer and I'll be back tomorrow night. I'm Robert McNeil. Good night.